going to kind of share with you what my process for research was for this play. Approaching plays is a little bit different than approaching some other topics because there's somebody's ideal of a certain topic. It's not historically factual all the time, it's somebody's perception of what happened. So as a dramaturg, what my responsibilities were to first research the basics of the play. What were the events going on? And in this case, for Two-Headed, it dealt with polygamy. It deals with the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Does everybody know what the Mountain Meadows Massacre is? Anybody not familiar with the event? Great. Let me give you a brief rundown. In 1857, travelers from Arkansas and Missouri were traveling through Utah to California to get some gold, because that's what everybody did in California in the 1850s. And they passed through Cedar City, Utah. And the Mormon people at this point in time were very paranoid. They'd had a visit from the army. They were basically going to be exterminated, and they were overly paranoid. And so the local leaders in Cedar City decided that they needed to kill all of these travelers. And things are a little fuzzy because some say Paiute Indians initiated the attack, others that they watched the Indians wash off the colors and turn into white people. So it's still a little fuzzy and hard to determine exactly what happened. But in essence, 130 travelers were brutally massacred in a place called Mountain Meadows, which is just outside of Cedar City, by Mormon militia leadership in southern Utah, and their bodies were just left there to decay in the sun, and nobody really knows who did it, but we'll talk a little bit about that today. So that's the Mountain Meadows, and I'm really sorry to put a downer on that, but that's what happened. Are we all familiar with polygamy, multiple spouses? Great. So what I did was, the first thing I did was I read the play and got some ideas. I pulled some names out of it. Julie Jensen was the playwright, and I spent a lot of time with her. She decided that she wanted to write about this event because she had heritage people who were there that did it, and she had a great-grandmother whose father was one of the members who was part of the militia party that killed the travelers. So we talked a lot about her perspectives of it, and her perspectives were very, very one-sided. She did not like anything to do with the LDS people. She didn't want to even look at that perspective. And so she had a very one view of the event as a whole, and my job was to figure out how do we bring everything together. And so the first thing that I did was I pulled out names. I looked, if you Google Mountain Meadows, 10 million things come up. So I wouldn't suggest Googling anything because it's a good starting off point to find names and people, but you never know what's true and what's not. The first thing I did, I actually went to the library. And the library for me is the best place in the whole wide world to start any research. The library, and are you guys familiar with EBSCO on the USU library site? The article database? Cool. So in the USU library, you can search for articles, and if you just put in keywords, I pulled up those, and these are peer-reviewed articles, so they're pretty factual and things like that. But I started at the library, and I read, I don't know, 10, 12 books about this horrible event that happened. And what was interesting is that this is an event that nobody can come to a consensus on. You know, the LDS people say, no, you know, it wasn't part of us, it wasn't the church, and then everybody else says, hey, it was, because there's nobody else here. So you just kind of got to pick and choose what you choose to believe, but my job in disseminating research, to sharing it with people, is not to pick a side. It's to produce and show this is what happened according to historical events. And once I read a lot of books, I got a lot of names of people. And from those names, I was able to go to historical records. In our library, we have a special collection section, which is journal articles and documents and things from people. You can't check them out, so you have to make an appointment to go there. And I started reading those articles and coding information. What I mean by coding is I would take chunks of the text and then write in a keyword to tell me what I was doing. So I take those chunks of information and kind of piece together this big, massive, I don't know, of how the events occurred. And why did we need to do this for the play? Well, because our actors in it have no idea what's going on. You know, you hear these events about, there's certain lines where the girls are like, well, this and this happened, but our actors don't really know because they weren't there and they haven't studied the event, and so we need to give them as clear and concisely as possible all the information that we can. And so we did this by going to books and going to articles very first. The magical thing about peer-reviewed articles is at the end they have a bibliography, and references, and so then you can go and look up where they got all of their information. And that was super helpful because it puts you on the right track to find what you need to. And you know, sometimes you find things and they're hit and miss and you're like, I don't really agree with that, but for me, doing research, you have to take into account every account because you can't just paint a picture of, I think it was this way according to me. You need to have all the information before you can say, this is what happened. And honestly, with Mountain Meadows, I don't think I can ever say this is what happened because there's so many diversified accounts. But I can say, okay, I know from 4 or 5 accounts we have this event and it's solid, and from 4 or 5 accounts we have this. And you start to piece together a picture that's more than one. My biggest thing when I'm doing research is that I like to find things that are said more than once. If it's said once, that's great to me, that's a great opinion. But if it's said more than once, then it must have some validity to it. Does that make sense? Cool. Some other places that I went for research was definitely to the playwright herself. She was able to produce artifacts that her family had collected from the event. She was able to produce journals, and she was able to give me these beautiful conversations about all of her research. And it was really fun to see how her research and my research butted up. I've been working on this play since last fall. Started last fall doing all the research, and it was a lot of things. I ended up with about 400 pages of polygamy and Mountain Meadows and horrible things that just aren't fun to research, but they're interesting because they're very pertinent to this community, and that was cool. So that's how I started. Do you have any questions about that, about finding resources? Everybody really tired and want to go back to spring break? Yes. I understand that. Okay, so for me, just to recap, finding resources, go to EBSCO. It's online, usu.edu. Click on the library tab. On the second tab, there's a box that comes up. The first one says search everything, and then the second one says search articles and databases. Search EBSCO for whatever topic you're looking for. They are a huge resource, and if you can get in there and find at least one article that pertains to your topic, look through their bibliography at the end of the article, and you'll be able to find like 10 or 15 more. I'll bet you $floppity jillion that happens. The second thing is, don't be afraid to go to the library. I grew up in a place where Google and Wikipedia were okay until I got to college and started working as an RA, and then it wasn't okay anymore. And so don't be afraid to look in print sources. You don't have to read a whole book. You get really good at skimming headlines and saying, okay, this is important to me and this is important to me. You don't have to read the whole thing. Just look for what's important to you and to your research. And then after that, I usually go to the internet and say, okay, what does all of everybody else say? But first, I like to get a really solid, peer-reviewed idea of what's going on before I go out and find all of the extra outlying information that's on the web. And Wikipedia is good for a lot of things. You can find sources on there, so if you're absolutely stuck, start there. But I guarantee you, if you look in EBSCO and you go to the library, that they will find things for you that are interesting. That's the interesting thing about doing research. You really have to find something you really love to research, or it's going to be a crapshoot for the rest of the time because you'll be bored and don't want to do it. Another really cool resource that we have here is, if you go to the library, they have an electronic database of theses and dissertations that you can read. It's called the ETD, Electronic Theses and Dissertations, and it is a huge help to see what other people have researched. And again, it'll give you a good jumping off point. For me, research is basically, you don't want to copy everything everybody else said, but you want to take into account their opinions and their perspectives as well, so you can form your own. It's not about quoting what other people have said, it's about figuring out what you want to say and what's true and what's honest. So that's how my process works. Any questions?